Same to you, Beck, yeah.
And we may have an accompanying sort of mareh mekomot, a source sheet, so that people can be, properly prepared for the chabura. That's pretty much it from us, from the admin team. Bechavod, Rav Kada.
Thank you very much, Avi. Hazak Baruch, everyone. It's always my pleasure to be here on the Sephardi Chabura and to share with you some words of Torah and tonight's topic. So this is my third shiur here. Last time, if you remember, we talked about Sukkot. We talked about the differences in the different approaches to the halachot of Sukkot. And the time before that, we talked about Bechira and Yediah, free will and knowledge. Tonight, we're talking from a halachic perspective. How important are denominations? And when we talk about denominations, we mean conservative and reform. So, what do they have any legitimacy at all? What's been the approach of our Chachamim to these questions concerning the relationship of orthodoxy to conservative and reform? And how do we go about this? Now, obviously, these are all very modern day she'elot, because the whole concept of reform is only about 200 years old, and conservative even less. And it's only in recent times when there's been more of an interaction between the two, and there's been some serious questions halachically with regards to what to do with our relationship with them. So these are very modern day she'elot, but much more than that, and this is the real difficulty, is that for reasons which maybe we'll discuss at the end, we Sephardim have never really had, today things are starting to become a bit different, but historically we've never really had this concept of reform and conservative. We've always had people who are more religious and less religious, more shomer Torah mitzvot and less shomer Torah mitzvot. We've never really put people in boxes, is he this or is he that? Because we've always focused more on practice rather than ideology. So to find in our Chachamim teshuvot on these questions are extremely difficult. And in fact, Hacham Ovadia, or the questions which we're going to discuss tonight, Hacham Ovadia doesn't discuss them anywhere. There's only one place where you'll see at the end where it comes up, and his opinion was slightly different to Moshe Feinstein. So what I want to do is go through in Moshe Feinstein's thought, how important a name and a denomination were for him. And we're going to see some really remarkable chidushim from Moshe Feinstein, which some questioned later on. But let's start. Now, Moshe Feinstein in 9 places, I don't know if we'll have time to go through all of them, but in 9 places, Moshe Feinstein discusses the legitimacy of important ceremonies performed by non-Orthodox clergy. So marriage, divorce, conversion. He discussed all of these in 9 different places. I'm not going to go through all the 9 in depth, but there's one which really shows you how, for Moshe, denominations were extremely important in his eyes. So let's start right from the beginning. We know that the Jewish wedding, let's start with a case of a wedding. We know with the wedding there are 2 parts. There's the Kiddushin and the Nisu'in. Traditionally, these were done over a long period of time, but in the olden days, what happened is you would do the Kiddushin, and you would give her the ring, and then later on you would do the Nisu'in. Now, at the Kiddushin stage, you're already betrothed, right? And she would need to get, once you do Kiddushin, you give the ring in the presence of 2 witnesses. You say that formula in the presence of 2 witnesses. That's all you need. You don't need a rabbi for Kiddushin to be effective. All you need is a man, a woman, and 2 witnesses. And that's a valid Kiddushin, and now the woman needs a get in order to remarry someone else. Now, how do you do the Kiddushin? You do it one of 3 ways: kesef, shtar, ubiyah, and the traditional way, which has become the accepted practice, you do it through giving money. Anything of monetary value you give to a woman, you give her a £10 note, that would be absolutely fine. And if you were to give her the £10 note in the presence of two witnesses and say Harat Mikudeshet Li, that would work. Now, there's quite a minhag from the Ramah's time that you would give a ring to the kala, as opposed to using money. You give a ring, and that's generally what we do today. That's I think universal in all chuppot today. That what happens is the chatan gives a ring to the kala and says Harat Mikudeshet Li. What does the kala do during this kiddushin process? Right, the bride's role in this part of the ceremony is basically silence and acceptance. She just stretches her finger. Obviously, she has to consent. Yeah, if she doesn't consent, then if she under duress she stretches her finger out, then obviously it's not going to work. If it was clear, if she made it clear that this is under duress, but assuming that there's consent, there's nothing is needed for her to say. She has to stretch her finger out, and that's absolutely fine. And that's how the kiddushin takes effect. Now, with the spirit of egalitarianism on the rise, already in the times of Moshe Feinstein, people started to ask whether, let's make things equal. If the Khatan can give a ring to the Kala, and he says Taharat Mikudeshet Li, then surely it would be the egalitarian thing to do is for her then to give a ring back to him, and for her to say to him, Harei at Mikudash Li. Hariatam Mikudash Li betabadzo. You are also betrothed to me according to the laws of Moshe and Israel. Right? That's egalitarianism. Yeah, things have to be equal. And Rav Moshe was the first person to discuss this in a teshuvah in 1970. This was in 1970 he discussed this. This is his teshuvah in this is his teshuvah in Even HaEzer Chelek Gimel Siman Yud Chet, Even HaEzer 3:18. So the first thing we need to know is what we're told very clearly. Have a look at the screen. We're told, Amar la hareni ishech, hareni baalech, hareni arusech, ino klum. If a man says to the woman, I am your husband, I am your betrothed, it's nothing. It's ineffective, the kiddushin. Mishum dichtiv ki yikach velo shikach et atzmo. Because the Torah says, ki yikach ish isha, that you take her unto you, the man takes the woman unto him, as opposed to him taking himself unto her. When you say hareni yishech, behold, I am your betrothed, I am your husband, then you're taking yourself unto her, as opposed to taking her unto you, and therefore that's an ineffective kiddushin, because the Torah says ki yikach ish isha velo shikach et atzmo, not that you take yourself to her. So far, so clear. And we're not going to go into this now, but this is the Torah understands that there's a big difference between males and females, as Rabbi Tatz has explained in various places. The zachar, the male, represents potential, the burst of energy. It's the woman it's the feminine which changes visions into reality. The greatest example of this is the birth of a child, where it's the spark of energy of a man, which is then taken by a woman over 9 months and formed into a human being, into a child. Which is why we say, for example, Shema beni musar avicha al titosh Torah imecha. Listen to the musar of your father, don't forsake the Torah of your mother. And everyone asks, what does this mean, don't forsake the Torah of your mother? Who teaches you Torah? Your father teaches you Torah. The father's command, Mishnah and Kiddushin. The father is commanded to teach the child Torah, not the mother. And they explain, because yes, it's the father who intellectually studies Torah, who teaches the Torah from an intellectual perspective, but ultimately it's the mother who takes the Torah and brings it down into a tangible manifestation in the home. And it's the Torah imecha. What you see a home is the Torah for your mother. It's how the mother takes that Torah study of the husband, the abstract part of Torah, and puts it into practice. That's the essence of how Torah appreciates the difference between men and women. The man is laying out the vision, and it's the woman who goes and takes it. And the same is in the Kiddushin as well. It's the man who has to lay out that vision. It's the man who has to take the Kiddushin He has to begin the kiddushin, begin that process of marriage, and then it's the woman who then goes and cultivates that marriage. She'll be the one reminding the husband about the 10th anniversary. She'll be the one reminding the husband about you need to go out for a date night. She'll be the one, it's her who normally cultivates the marriage as opposed to this isn't always the case. Obviously, there's always exceptions, but that's generally the case. So, ki shisha, the man has to take the woman and not vice versa. Now, what we just saw in the Shulchan Aruch was when he says to her, I will be your husband. So he takes himself to her. What about where he gives her and says nothing? And she then says, I will be married to you. Okay, so she says, I will be married to you. So that halacha is, and that's a good expression, that works. But because we don't know what he intended when he gave her the ring, was he giving her the ring as just a present? Or was he giving it to her b'toras kiddushin? For what effect was he giving her the ring? Because we don't know, she's safek mikudeshet. It's a doubtful betrothal. But the actual fact that she spoke to him is fine, and that's effective. That works. If she says to him, I will be your husband, and it's clear that he agrees to that, he nods his head, for example, or there's other circumstantial evidence which shows you that when he was giving over the ring to her, he was giving it to her b'torat kiddushin, that's absolutely fine. So there's no defect in her speaking and in her saying that I want to bring myself over to you. That's not the end of the world. The problem is if he takes himself over to her. However, what we're discussing, and this was the question Moshe Feinstein was asked, was not when she says to him, I am betrothed to you, but rather when she says to the Hatan, you are betrothed to me. That's the problem. Because then she's not taking herself unto him, but rather she's taking him to her. So Moshe Feinstein was asked, if the Hatan gives the ring to the Kala, and he says to her the correct formula, and then she takes the ring, accepts the ring, and then she responds, and she says, as soon as she receives the ring, she says back to him, the presence of two witnesses, Hare atam mikudash li. Behold, you are betrothed to me, and I'm taking you as a husband. Is that an effective kiddushin or not? What would you say? Any suggestions from the floor? Is that an effective kiddushin or not?
Why would it make a difference? He said what he has to say. This is just like a new thing, Add on to it.
Obviously, anyone has any different opinion to that, to Maud? I think it's pretty straightforward you're saying, Maud, and I think every Bardat would agree to that. And that's exactly what Moshe Feinstein writes. Let me share the screen. Says Moshe, "Vaday li'inyan kiddushin, ma'achar shekvar nitkadesha kadin, hem kiddushin gemurim." He gave her the ring. He said the correct formula, exactly like you said, Maud. U'ma shegam hi natna v'gam amra, ma she'amra hem. Look at these words now. I'm going to come back to them. Hem divrei hevel u'shtut. What she said afterwards, it's there's no, it's absolutely ineffective. There's no point to it. It's hevel u'shtut. It's rubbish. So he gives her the ring. She's mikudeshet. She then goes and gives something to him. Okay, that's worthless from the perspective of halakha. That's worthless. Nonetheless, he says you're not allowed to do this. He says two reasons. One reason he says is because of Chokot HaGoy. That's not so convincing that. But then the second reason he says is because, then this is his main reason, is that this is going to cause people to forget what Kiddushin is. They're going to think that Kiddushin is when either of the couple give each other a ring, and then in 50, 100 years' time, that's how minhag evolves, right? And Rosh has a very strong point here. That's how minhag evolves. In 200 years' time, people will be saying, my great-grandparents, my grandmother gave the ring to my great-grandfather. So why can't I just give the ring to my husband? This is going to cause the Kiddushin to be forgotten, and therefore it's asur to do this. But the effect of the Kiddushin is, once you've done it, that it's absolutely fine. What she does afterwards is divrei hevel u'shtut. There's no validity to it. Okay, good. That makes sense. But here we come to the major chidush, the major novel point of Moshe, which shows you how, in his eyes, how important denominations were. He was asked exactly the same question later on where this happened, but this happened under the auspices of a Reform rabbi. So exactly the same story. He gave her the ring, she gave the ring back to him and said the same formula, and this happened in the presence of a Reform rabbi. Now, there's going to be some problems in a Reform wedding, and that's going to be that normally the witnesses won't be kasher. Because in order for a witness to be kasher, he has to be shomer Torah mitzvot. At the very least, he can't have a dut against him that he transgresses Shabbat or something like that. To be a valid witness. So that's going to be one problem. But let's assume that wasn't the case. Let's assume this wedding is taking place in a Reform temple with the Reform rabbi. Everyone there is Reform. And there happens to be the two witnesses are two Orthodox people. This happened to be. Two halachic, Orthodox, Edim, and they did this thing. He gave her the ring, she gave him the ring. What is then the status of the Kiddushin? Any suggestions? Maud, what's the difference now? Exactly.
I'm going to assume that there is an issue because
Why?
it's Reform, which is why we've got a separate question.
But there's not a man, you got a woman, you got two Orthodox witnesses.
So it's why they're doing it. It's where's it coming from?
What do you mean where's it coming from?
In the case of the first issue, in the case of the first case, it was an Orthodox thing. They're doing it because modern, yeah. But now they might be doing it because they actually believe that things have changed in kind of like there's been a paradigm shift and in the whole.
But even if they believe that, but surely he's given her the ring and said what she does afterwards, as soon as he gives her, remember, he's giving her the ring. And as soon as he gives her the ring.
You're right. On the surface, I agree. Why should it be different?
You said before that you don't need a rabbi.
You don't need a rabbi. No, you don't.
So from an Orthodox point of view, you don't have a rabbi, but you have two witnesses.
Exactly. What's the problem?
Lo ma'alev lo morid.
Lo ma'alev lo morid. You've done the Kiddushin. It's been done. And that's it. Okay.
What about the Kedat Moshe and Aaron? Okay, so Kedat. Maybe there's a problem in that.
Without saying that, it's fine. Those are extra words. You don't need to say that. Harat Mekudesh is fine. There's a machloket if you just say Harat Mekudesh that li yadayim mochichot, yadayim she'enan mochichot in Kiddushin, right? But just to say that is fine. You don't have to say Kedat Moshe Yisrael. Says Moshe, and have a look at the screen. He says no. It's not Kiddushin. Not only is it not Kiddushin, it's not even Kiddushin Nechumra. Meaning, sometimes when you have a doubt about halakha, you'll say that we're not sure, okay, so we'll give a get Lechumra. Here he says, it's not Kiddushin. You don't need a get at all. Why? Let's see this remarkable teshuvah inside. This is in 325. B'kedushay Reforma. He says, the af shenoten tabat, hari gam hi notenet tabat. The exchanging rings. Umochiach netinato. Her giving of the ring back, a new ring to him, that proves shurak matana ba'alma shanasu ish v'isha, aval asiyat kiddushin haya belo klum b'af devarim ulayinam. Well, he says there is something amazing. He says, because it's under Reform auspices. And it's under an Orthodox rabbi. What's happening is that because she's giving him a ring back, then what that means is that this isn't really a Maaseh Kiddushin. What's happening here is just an exchange of rings. And they're giving gifts to one another. And he says, first he says, first he says, but just one sentence. He says, probably there aren't kosher witnesses. But that's not his main point. You see clearly that's not his main point. Because he goes on for the rest of the teshuvah to talk about the fact that they're Reform. Because they are Reform, that means that they're doing it just out of exchanging gifts. But then he asks the question. He says, look, when there's civil marriage, Rab Henkin, or Moshe's contemporary, held that if a couple live together for a few years and they get civilly divorced, they need a get as well. Moshe disagreed with this. But Moshe held that lechatchila we should be concerned for the opinion of Rav Henkin, and that's what all Batei Dinim do today, by the way, is that when a couple gets civilly divorced, we try to get a get. If for whatever reason we can't, the husband doesn't want to give the get, then we'll allow them to get remarried out of the get. But definitely in the first instance, Moshe himself held that you have to try to get a get. Because civil divorce, they've lived together, perhaps the bi'ah creates the kiddushin. We won't go to the whole machloket there, but that's what. So Moshe was asked, I don't understand. Why should this be worse than a civil marriage? Yeah, because even if you want to say the kiddushin was nothing, but they went home and lived together for 5 years. So surely now they should need a get. So Moshe, no, this is unbelievable. Because it was a reform marriage, she doesn't even need to get l'chumrah as a stringency. This is even worse than a civil marriage. Why? Let's see. וממילא מסתבר שאין לחוש אפילו מחזיק בישראל כמה שנים. דגרה זה לעניין נישואי הקהל. This is even worse than a civil marriage. Why? Because נישואין דרפורמה, האותן שהולכים לשם, הרי סוברים דזהו דיני קידושים ונישואין של ישראל, שכל הבעלות הם דעת הקידושים הראשונים. Because when you have a civil marriage, then, okay, I'm not religious. I got civilly married. I know there's such a concept as a Jewish marriage. I'm not going to go for that. Okay, I'm just going to do a civil marriage. But you know there's a concept of Kiddushei Israel. And therefore, you can say that perhaps when they had relations together, he was having it for the purpose of acquiring her as a wife, and therefore you need to get as a chumrah, as a stringency. But with reform weddings, he says, when you're going there, well, the Hatan and Kala going there, they're going to exchange gifts. And they think this is the religious ceremony. It's amazing what Moshe is doing here. He's like he's taking it in both ways. On the one hand, he's saying that they're going there not as a religious ceremony, they're going there as just exchange of gifts, matanot be'alma. If that's the case, then the relations afterwards, that should make them married. They should need to get. No. Because afterwards, all the relationships which they have, it's al dat, the previous kiddushin, which was under the chuppah, which was a waste of time, which was absolutely nothing. You get that? So he's like using it both ways. ולכן דינה, כיוון שהיה קידושין על ידי הרפורמה, rabbi, אין צורך להחמיר כלל. No need to be stringent. והיכא שיש להם בנים, לך גם גמלה לך. Actually, if she's already had a child from the second marriage, you shouldn't be stringent. You should not give a get, because that would be a Okay, so Sina asks, what about the principle of in adam oseh bilato bilat znut? Wow, Sina, it's nice terminology. I like that. So yeah, you're right, 100%. That's exactly what Moshe is saying. Of course, en adam oseh bilato bilat znut, and therefore we assume that it's going to be for kiddushin. Yeah. But what Moshe is saying here is that en adam oseh bilato bilat znut, that's when I didn't have any civil marriage, any Torah marriage, any halachic marriage. I just got civilly married, and then you can say, and therefore probably he wanted that bilah, those relations, to be a marriage, and therefore she needs a get. But here, what he's saying is with the reform wedding, they are having their relations later al dat, on the premise of their previous wedding. He's not gonna have in mind an Adam Oseh B'Dat Znut, because Remi's already had a wedding. He doesn't need to do an Adam Oseh B'Dat Znut, because Remi already had a kosher wedding. When I never had a wedding, then you can say the relations afterwards, that's an Adam Oseh B'Dat Znut, and therefore that's going to be the marriage. But when I've already had my marriage, why should I have my further relations to be not an Adam Oseh B'Dat Znut? So this is unbelievable. For Moshe,
Rav,
yeah.
Why does Rav Moshe? Why does he assume that that they're now shifting and saying they're only giving gifts? Why can't it be just like he is koneh her, now egalitarian, she is going to be koneh him? Why is it just matanot be'alma?
I mean, he makes it clear in the. I don't know if you highlighted it, but no, he says that they're reciprocal. They're not. It's the reciprocal. Going both ways.
Where's he getting that from? Where's that coming from? Why do we not think that they've been explained by their? I mean, a lot of reform rabbis know their stuff. Why would they not have told them? You know.
So no, if you I don't know if we read it, but he says It's like a non-Jewish wedding where a man says, "Do you take this person and do you take that person?"
It's like the priest. It's like when you go to the church and the priest asks him and asks her, "Do you want to be married to one another?" It's the same thing happening. The Reform rabbi is like a priest. He's saying.
So as in, there's no kinyan.
No, exactly. There's no kinyan.
So, yeah, right. So, but is that what Rav Moshe is basing it upon, basically?
That's a Moshe's own svara. His own svara. He's got to prove for it.
He doesn't have proof for it. But why do we assume that?
What do you mean we? When you're saying we, what does we mean?
Why does Rav Moshe assume that? Could we not see that the Reform go out and explain to them?
That's the whole point of this shiur. This I'm showing you how important denominations are.
Right. Okay. Right. So this is what we're saying. Okay. Fine. Say that.
I mean, we're going to see this even clearer in a few other teshuvot. For him, Reform, and you have to understand, of course. I was going to come to the end. You have to understand the context. Again, we've said this so many times. Halakha has to be understood in its context. But Moshe was living in the middle of the 20th century. There was such a huge fight between orthodoxy and non-orthodoxy movements, right? And therefore, for Moshe, he fought orthodoxy, he fought Reform to the end. Yeah, and for him, he wanted to make sure that no one would even have a doubt that Reform has any validity at all. Now, has v'shalom, that I'm going to be implying that Moshe is coming to this more political stance. Has v'shalom, because he's saying you don't need to give a get, right? But I'm showing you how for Moshe, Reform have absolutely nothing at all. If it was just political, what Moshe was saying, they would say give a get l'chumrah, right? He would say, okay, it's matanot ba'alma, there's no validity, but just in case, give a get as a stringency. He doesn't say that. He says, there's no el mala lachmir, there's no need to be machmir at all. For him, he's certain, and this is the point, that this is like in a church. Him giving her giving him, it's just an exchange of gifts. It's not a kinyan in the sense I'm doing a maaseh kiddushin now.
Rabbi, can I ask a question just to clarify something? The argument's kind of built around the bride or the woman then saying, I betrothed you to me afterwards. And in that happening and there being a Reform rabbi, it's not...
Reform context.
It's not considered legitimate. But if the woman did not say that, would the argument still hold? If it was just that the man...
No. Then it would be absolutely fine kiddushin.
It would be fine. Even within a Reform context, he would say...
It was. As I said, the rabbi is worthless. All you need is a man, a woman, and 2 witnesses. You don't need a rabbi for a wedding. So they had some ceremony.
Yeah.
He gave her the ring, and because she didn't give a ring back to him, then this is obviously a proper kiddushin.
But it's the fact that she's giving the ring back within a Reform context that invalidates it.
That then is mochia, the mafreya, that then retroactively shows you that him giving her was just an exchange of gifts and not a maaseh kinyan, not an acquisition.
Understood.
Which is why, by the way, Hershel Schachter is unhappy with this Moshe. Because he says there's no concept of the Gemara says there's no concept of Toch Dibur with Kiddushin, right? If you give Kiddushin and then Toch Dibur you attract, it's still Kiddushin, right? If you go to a woman in front of 2 witnesses, and you put the ring on her, and within 3 seconds you retract, it's still Kiddushin. It says Reb Hershel, I don't understand. Had he, as you just said, Adam, had he just given her the ring, that would have been fine. Okay, so later on, a few seconds later, she gives the ring back to him, and this retroactively then shows. That's too late. And the second he gave it to her, okay, now we're getting into a different question. I don't want to go down that line. That's what Moshe argues. He's not arguing with the Moshe from the Reform problem. Yeah, he's agreeing to that. He's just saying there's another issue here of Toch Dibur, which is why he's unhappy about it. The answer to Reb Hershel Schachter's kasha is that in Kiddushin there's a concept of da'at. It has to be da'at. And even though there's no Toch Dibur, but if there's no da'at, meaning that I can see later on from his action that there was no da'at for Kiddushin, and that's enough to invalidate the Kiddushin. Okay. I'll come back to this discussion of Bi'atov L'Tznut later, because that's tangential, but I'll come back to these points. I want to continue with the main points. So you see clearly how Moshe thought, wow, how important denominations are. When a Reformed Jew does something, there's a presumption it didn't intend it to be for a halachic wedding. Okay? Now, have a look And then another Teshuvah, Moshe was asked whether a rabbi can, it was asked by conservative, and he basically said the same thing with conservative. And then he said, so Maud, have a look what he says here. ואולי נראה שהוא רק מעשה צחוק דחילופין דדינת מתות דסימן בעלמא שנעשו בחשיבות איש ואשתו, ולא שהוא מעשה קניין אישות, שזיך התורה, שאולי לפי כוונה זו, הוא לא נעשו קדושי תורה, בקדושי כלל. והוא אצלי ספק גדול שמצאתי לזה ראיה עדיין. That's very interesting. In conservative, he's equivocal about it. And we'll see this again consistently in the Moshe. With conservative, he's slightly more sympathetic. We'll see this in a number of Teshuvot. He's slightly more sympathetic. But you see, even though he says it's Safek Gadol, that's enough for him in the previous Teshuvah to say you don't need a get, which is really remarkable. And then he continues and he says, if a rabbi is asked to do a wedding in such a conservative place and he's concerned he's going to lose his parnasah, if he doesn't do so, he could do the wedding. He should just say at the beginning of the wedding that the kiddushin is affected by him giving her and not vice versa. So that you see clearly in the context of weddings, you see how for Moshe, how important it was, the denominations. Fine. Let's move on now to a different context. Let's move on to the context of conversion now. And here, I don't know if I can share Otzar HaChochmah. Here we are. Okay, can you see Otzar HaChochmah? Can everyone see the screen? Siman Kuf Samach in Moshe? Can you see that?
Yeah.
You can't see it?
Nothing yet.
Well, I don't think it allows me to share Otzar. I'm trying to share Otzar HaChochmah.
Maybe take a screenshot if you've got a snipping tool.
And then screenshot on what? From my phone?
If you have the snipping tool, you can take a screenshot using that, and then you can share that.
Just do a cut and paste into a Word document, and then share the Word document or something like that.
I'm still new to it, so okay, I'll have to just read it out then. So the Moshe was asked about conversion by a conservative rabbi. Okay? So what validity does that have? Is this in any way? And he was asked whether they could be buried in a Jewish cemetery, an Orthodox Jewish cemetery. So he says, in this Teshuvah, this is Yoredea Kuf Samach, and he says here that of course, for conversion to be valid, the conversion has to take place in the presence of three witnesses. Three people. It has to be Kabbalat mitzvot, acceptance of mitzvot in the presence of three people. These people don't have to be rabbis. They can even be lay people. Even the Gemara says afilu shosha idiotot. In the first instance, it should be talmidei hachamim. Therefore, we will try to take rabbis, but it doesn't have to be. It can even be in the presence of three lay people. But he says the conservative rabbis, they probably didn't tell them about the Kabbalat mitzvot. And he says more than that. Even if they did, that pasul, the conservative rabbis are pasul for a bedin because they're kofer beharbei karei hadat. They deny many of the fundamentals of our principle. And even though we don't know, but then he asks the question, this is a very important point, this is the crucial point of his teshuvah, is that even if a person is mehalel Shabbat, for example, a person in mehalel Shabbat, he is still kasher for edut, he can still give testimony as long as we haven't seen him doing so. So let's say we know this person drives to synagogue, he lives very far and he still happens to come every single week to synagogue for Shabbat. That person is still, we wouldn't take him, but he's still kasher as an aid because we don't have a testimony that he's mechalel Shabbat. So he asks, okay, no one's actually come forward with edut that they heard these conservative rabbis spouting heresy. So therefore, it should still be that they are kasher to be the rabbis on the conversion. He says, listen to this line. This is the crucial line. Anan sahade. There's a universal witness. Shekol mi sheshem habazui conservative alav. Anyone who has this despicable name of conservative upon him, who beheskat mufkar leharbei surin ukfira barbei karim. There's a hazakah. There's a nan sahade. Nan sahade is a concept in Shas where even though we haven't seen something, but because it's so obvious, it's as if everyone has testified to it. And anyone he says who's got the name of conservative on him, that's going to be definitely, he's a kofer, and therefore v'lachen pashut she'en hagirut she'asa harabbi klum. The conversion he's done is absolutely nothing, and it's worthless, and you shouldn't allow him to be buried in the Jewish cemetery. If this is going to be cause problems, then at least make sure they're buried not near to Orthodox people, he says later on. So for him, he's saying something remarkable. The name conservative, and it's even conservative, or the more so reform, the name conservative is enough to say there's a non-sahadik, there's a universal testimony here. This person's a kofar, he's a heretic, and therefore his conversion is invalid. There's absolutely no validity at all. Now, this is the important point. And later poskim relied on a few inconsistencies in Moshe to be more sympathetic to conservative. Now, I question what, look, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the difference between reform and conservative. Conservative historically are very different to the conservative today, right? You have to, especially in America. Conservative in America, it's well known that there were Orthodox rabbis who led conservative temples. There were even Orthodox rabbis who learned in conservative seminaries. I'm sure some of you have heard of Shaul Lieberman, right? Yeah, everyone's heard of. Yeah, have you heard of Saul Lieberman? Rabbi Saul Lieberman. Yeah, he taught in the conservative seminary. There was a big discussion in well, exactly who was he? Was he Orthodox? Was he? I recommend the Mark Shapiro's book on this, Saul Lieberman and the Orthodox. Excellent book, where he goes through all the different rabbis and their opinions to Saul Lieberman, and how the majority of rabbis actually accept him as a conservative, as an Orthodox rabbi, despite him teaching in the conservative seminary. But conservative was very different to what it is today. Today, conservatives we can basically lump conservative together with reform today, and that there's very little observance of mitzvot. Historically, 50 years ago, many conservative people would be shomer kashrut properly, would keep Shabbat properly. They would drive to shul on Shabbat, but just to drive to shul. But in all other senses, they would keep Shabbat properly. That was conservative in those days. So it's questionable whether those who want to say that there's a distinction between conservative and reform today still is true. But in Moshe's thought, at least, conservative, we've just seen, was for him nothing. But then we come to a different question. This is in, let me give you the Marei Makom. This is in Even HaEzer, Chelek Aleph, and Kuf Lamed Gimel, Kuf Lamed Hey, 135. So, Even HaEzer 135. There he was asked about a conservative rabbi who signed on a get. Is the get a kasher get or not? Can she remarry? And the husband's gone, the husband doesn't want to give another get. So can she remarry or not? And then he says again the same thing. And yeah, so Sinner, you've just proven my point. Very good, thank you. And this is a really important point which I want to touch on at the end. So Moshe again reiterates. He says, "Gamba apikorsim, it's muhzak by the conservative apikorsim." And then he says, listen to this: "Be'elu shelamdu b'seminar conservative, them rabbis, b'batei kisot shelehem, they're ministers. Yesh ulai lachshivan kemuchzakin lekofrim, kivan shenishemu b'talmidim." Perhaps they are a muhzak to be a kofer because they went to their seminaries. Yesh gam svara lomar, there's a contrasting svara to say, the kivan shematzu elu shelomdim sham eze zman b'shvil parnasa, אחר כך משרת רבי בבית הכנסת שלהם, שמשם יותר, או יתרחץ קטן לחשדם בכופרים. He says the conservatives pay more. Reform and conservative temples pay more. Okay? I think this is still true, by the way. But since they pay more, so he's going for parnasa reasons. He doesn't really believe. So perhaps this is as far to say that despite him being a rabbi of a conservative synagogue, then it doesn't invalidate the get, and he says it's a safek if this rabbi is pasul le'idut. So here already, now in the end he allows it to remarry for a different reason, because there was a sofer there as well, together with the other aid, and that was enough to make two. the whole problem is mizuyaf mitocho. Okay, he allowed it in the end. But here you already start to see some sympathy towards some conservative rabbis, and to say they're conservative. Okay, some of them, they're just going there to get the money, but they're not really conservative in their ideology. Now, I saw a very strong argument against this idea that they only went there to get money, and that's, one of the basic principles of Hilchot Eidut is that a person has to be an honest person. Yeah, when it comes to gezela, even something small of theft is enough to make a person pasul le'idut. Even though in other things it has to be doraita and has to be in the presence of witnesses, etc. When it comes to accusations of theft and anything got to do with money, when it comes to witnesses, then we're very stringent. The halacha and choshen mishpat, siman lamed dalet, we're very strict when it comes to theft. It's really funny for me how, okay, he went to the conservative synagogue to become rabbi to get more money, and therefore he's not his ideology isn't treif, he's still kasher, but we'll still trust him that he'll give kasher edut. But maybe he's getting paid for that kasher edut. If he's tempted by money to take a ministry by conservative and reform, then why won't he be tempted also to give false testimony? I find very interesting against Moshe. But that's what he says. There he really starts to show some sympathy for conservative. The problem is, and he contradicts himself in Even Ezer, Helek Bet, Teshuvah Yud Zayin, 217, where there he writes very clearly, I'll read out to you just 3 lines, and there he's talking about Kiddushin through a conservative rabbi. He says, Ulinyan ima Kiddushin tofsin, הרבי עצמו פשוט שפסול לעדות, ואין חילוק אם היה מתחילה רב קונסרבטיב שלמד בסמינה שלהם, או שהיה רב מוסמך שקיבל משרה בטמפל הקונסרבטיב. Even if he didn't learn the conservative, but he went to become a minister in a conservative temple, that in itself is enough to make him to make the Kiddushin invalid, and it won't be good enough. So here this seems to be contradicting. This has been pointed out by the poskim, that this seems to contradict what he said earlier on, that there may be room to be lenient with the conservative rabbi because perhaps he only took the position for monetary purposes. Again, and I think this will be the last teshuvah I'll bring forward. There's many more from Moshe on this, but this is the last one I'll bring. This is in Even Ezer Chelek Gimel Siman Gimel. There he talks about the conversion of a reform rabbi, and again I'm just going to read out you one sentence, but again he says this name business, where he says, Hashem Reform Me'id Shen Kofrim. The fact that you have this title, Rabbi of the Reform Synagogue, that in itself makes you pasul, regardless if you're Shomer Torah Mitzvot. If you have that title, you now become a pasul le'idut, you become invalid for testimony. So again, you see this principle, how for him, it's the name, it's the title, which makes in that reform of it, there's no room to be lenient at all. Reform, it's clear that they're going to be pasul, and there's a chazakah, there's a kofer. Now, again, you see some slight sympathy to conservative when he was asked to Moshe about conservatives using an Orthodox mikveh for their conversions. So what do you say about that? You have in America, you have an Orthodox mikveh run by an Orthodox synagogue, and a conversion of a conservative who wants to come and use the mikveh to convert the candidate. So he says, if it's owned by the Orthodox only, then they shouldn't allow it because of a number of reasons. Lifnei Iver, perhaps it's a stumbling block. But then he says, if it's however it's owned jointly by both, if the conservative paid towards the construction of the mikveh and therefore they have a share in it, he said you can't say no to them. You have to allow them to use the mikveh. And then he says, what about the problem of Lifnei Iver? He says there's no Lifnei Iver because there are other mikvot. They can use another mikveh. That's a big chiddush there, by the way. There's a big machloket. Lifnei Iver means you can't put a stumbling block in front of someone. You can't go someone to sin. And here he's saying that it's not a problem of lifnei iver because anyway they could go and use a different mikveh. And the halacha is that when you can use it in a different, when you can anyway get to that sin by yourself, you don't need you, then it's not a problem for you to help. Sometimes, I'm not going to go into all details, but here he's saying a big chidush that even though you're going to have to rely on another Jew doing the isur, still we don't see lifnei iver. That's a very interesting point there, which is very debatable. And he also says that he also says something funny. He says that actually, if you say no to them, they may end up building their own mikveh. And this will then cause Orthodox women to go and use their mikveh mistakenly, and that's going to be a problem. Their mikveh is not going to be kasher. They're not going to look after the halachot properly. So he says, now he doesn't rely on that by itself, meaning if the Orthodox have the ability, they are in control of the mikveh, then they can say no. They can say that this is our mikveh. We only allow Jewish women to use the mikveh, and anyone else wants to use the mikveh, we don't allow unless it's someone who contributed towards the building. Right? That makes sense. But and then we don't say his svarot. But if it's jointly owned, then he says you have to allow them, and he gets around the other problems. So in this sense, he was slightly sympathetic to the conservative. Now, as I showed you, there are inconsistencies. What's clear is with regards to reform. Let's summarize what we've seen so far. With regards to reform, we saw this remarkable teshuvah in Moshe with regards to this handing over of the rings. Now, the context of the reform rabbi and the reform ceremony shows that the couple have no intention for marriage, and therefore no get is needed. And when it comes to conversions by reform rabbis, there's absolutely no validity to it at all, because the name reform makes you taref, and therefore you cannot give any legitimacy to it. With conservative, we see in he's slightly contradictory. In the most of the places, he says conservative is nothing at all, but in other places, he shows some sympathy to conservative. And there's a very interesting teshuvah, which was written by Harav Israel Meir Yonah, one of the Dayanim on the Bet Din in Yerushalayim. This was in the lifetime of Chacham Ovadia. And he wrote a teshuvah, which I'm happy to share with the Chabur afterwards if you're interested, which Rabbi Ovadia signed at the bottom and said, I've gone through this, and I agree to everything he said, and I allow this woman to marry. What happened in this case is as follows. A woman converted through conservative. Through conservative, the woman, again, through reform has no validity. The woman converted through conservative. And she had a child. And then later on, she became more religious. She became Orthodox. And they told her, look, your conversion, some people may cause problems with it. Go do another Giur L'Chumrah, do another conversion as a stringency. And she went and she did a conversion with her daughter. Okay, great. The daughters, they're now both fully Jewish. Daughter gets older and she starts to date. And guess what? She falls in love with a Kohen. So a Gioret can't marry a Kohen. So the problem here is like this. If we say the first conversion of the conservative was a valid conversion for the mother, then she was a Jew. She then had her baby. That baby's a regular Jew. That's Kirin Shulchan Aruch. A Gioret who has as long as the Gioret marries another Jew, not a Gioret who marries a Ger, the child's a Sur to Kohen. But a Gioret who marries a Yisrael, then that child is now kasher and can now go and marry a Kohen. So if the mother's conversion was a valid conversion, excellent. She was a Jewish when she gave birth, and the girl is Jewish, and she can marry a Kohen. If, however, the conservative conversion wasn't a conversion, and then when she became Jewish was when she went to the mikvah later with her daughter. That means the daughter's a Gioret, the daughter can marry the Kohen. Anyway, long teshuvah, and his conclusion is that it depends on, and I think this makes a lot of sense. It depends on well, let me say, he says that he points out these inconsistencies in Moshe's teshuvah, and he basically says that because what they found out about him is that the rabbis at the time who did the conversion were Shomer Torah mitzvot. It's enough to say that there was a conversion, and therefore they allowed her to marry a Kohen. And again, and as I said, they point out these inconsistencies in Moshe, and they want to argue that even Moshe himself held that conservatives sometimes, and they want to say the reason why Moshe contradicts himself is because it depends on the context and who the conservative rabbis are. Because as I said, conservative 50 years ago was a very broad section. What exactly does conservative mean? There were some who were right-wing conservative, who were almost orthodox, and practiced halakha properly. And there were those who were left-wing conservative, almost reform. And so basically what they're saying is it depends on, when it comes to conservative conversions and conservative weddings and gitin, then it really depends. You have to do an investigation of who the conservative rabbis are in order to ascertain whether they were Shomer Torah mitzvot. And in this case, they allowed the woman to get married to the Kohen. There's another excellent teshuvah which is really worthwhile reading, which summarizes everything which we've been through, really, Shut Maria Bazak of Eretz Chemda, which if you're interested, I'll be happy to share afterwards, which is a very similar case, which they also allowed at the end. Now, for me, I think, these were questions dealt with 50 years ago. The question of Yisrael Me'o now was dealt with about 15 years ago. The recent one of Mareha Bazak was 3 years ago. But I really think that today, as Sina points down in the chat box, and we'll come back to all the other questions in the chat box later, is that conservative today, at least in England, it's very difficult to argue that they are Shomer Torah mitzvot enough for them to be a Kabbalat mitzvot for a conversion or for a kiddushin. So I doubt whether today we could rely on these types of things, even as a safek. So what we've seen in these teshuvot really is how Rav Moshe, at least for him, how he related to the Orthodox and to the Conservative and the Reform in relation to conversions, divorce, and weddings. Now, as I said, it's very difficult to find Sephardi teshuvot on this because we didn't really have these issues. We don't have 50 years ago. We didn't have Reform communities of Sfaradim. Today, things are starting to change, very unfortunately, and this may be the influence of the Ashkenazim upon Sephardi Jewry. That because of the influence of Ashkenazi Jewry upon Sfaradim, then we're starting to put people in boxes. We've always seen Jews as Jews. You're not so religious, okay, not so religious. Okay, we'll still accept you. We'll try to help you become religious and all of that. But we don't like to put people and say, he's taref and he's this. But obviously there was a huge intellectual debate, war in the last 200 years amongst the Ashkenazim, which is why Rav Moshe was coming so strongly against them, because of the historical context in Germany and in America, how conservative reform, the trouble they were making. Now, from a non-halachic perspective, I just want to say 2 points and we'll end with this. And that's as follows. It's famous, Yosef Ber Soloveitchik. He said that there are two brits, there are two covenants that Jewish people have, the Jewish Am Yisrael have. One he called the Brit Yi'ud as in destiny, a covenant of where we're going. Another he said Brit Goral, is a covenant of fate, of what happens to us. And what he said is when it comes to the Brit Yi'ud, when it comes to a covenant of destiny, where we are going as Am Yisrael, then he said we cannot participate with the Reform and the Conservative because they have a different destiny to us. And therefore we cannot unite with them when we're discussing things affecting the Jewish people, its future, and so on and so forth. But when he said it comes to covenant of fate, and when it comes to cooperation and matters facing the communal Am Yisrael, about our response to non-Jewish people, our response to communal matters, then actually he said it's absolutely fine, and he encouraged actually participation with other denominations, and he said this wouldn't give them legitimacy, because in that sense we're all one nation. in the sense of us having to protect ourselves from our enemies around us, in the sense of, our similar values, whether it's circumcision, let's say, in these types of things, our faith as Am Yisrael, these types of things would be permissible to be able to share a platform with other denominations. Again, he's not granting legitimacy to them, but for certain types of things, it would be fine to collaborate with them. There was a beautiful address by Norman Lamb of Yeshiva University, which I'm sharing. Can you see the screen now? Is it working? Share screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. It's worthwhile reading it all. I'm just gonna, it wasn't highlighting here, just worthwhile reading a couple of sentences here. Here he is. Should non-Orthodox Rabbi want to know out of curiosity whether I, as a centrist Orthodox Jew, recognize, Norman Lamb was passionate about this concept of modern Orthodoxy, and he famously once said, modern Orthodoxy isn't moderately passionate. Modern Orthodoxy is passionately moderate. Okay, that was his idea of a centrist Jew. And he writes here, as a centrist Orthodox Jew, do I recognize their credentials as rabbis? I'll tell you where I stand. My premise is that Orthodox Judaism is by very nature tied to a transcendent vision, to a being who's beyond us. That vision includes the revelation of Torah and Halakha, etc., the word of God, etc. 3 categories to consider in the recognition of legitimation, delegitimation issues are functional validity, spiritual dignity, and Jewish or rabbinic legitimacy. Because Orthodox Rabbi consider these movements not bound by Jewish halakha, I consider this an error. It's an error that they don't give them any credibility at all. Facts cannot be wished away by theories, no matter how cherished. The facts are the Reform conservative communities are not only more numerous in their official membership in the Orthodox community than in those days, but they are also vital, powerful, and dynamic. They are committed to Jewish survival, each according to its own light. They are part of Klal Yisrael, and they consider their rabbis their leaders. From a functional point of view, therefore, non-Orthodox rabbis are valid leaders of Jewish religious communities. And it's both fatuous and self-defeating not to acknowledge that this openly and draw the necessary consequence, for example, establishing friendly and harmonious and respectful relationships and working together, all of us, towards those Jewish communal and global goals that we share. I have no trouble in acknowledging the functional validity of non-Orthodox rabbinic leadership, but also in granting that non-Orthodox rabbis and lay people may possess spiritual dignity. This is really interesting. If they are sincere, if they believe in God, if they are motivated by principle, not by convenience or trendiness, right? Then they are religious people. Really amazing that he calls them religious people. In the sense they're no different from Orthodox Jews who may attain such spiritual dignity if their faith is not, etc. But, and this is the crucial point, what we've seen over the last hour, neither functional validity nor spiritual dignity are identical with Jewish legitimacy. Validity derives from the Latin validus, strong. It's a factual, descriptive term. Legitimacy derives from the Latin lex, law. It's a normative and evaluative term, and so on and so forth. I think it's really excellent. This. What he's saying here is that just because what we've seen in the last hour, where we've seen the teshuvot, and no one argues with Moshe substantively with regards to reform or conversions or weddings or gitin. They may have problems with his other svarot, but even those who argue the Moshe with the wedding case, they're not arguing with the problem of reform. Everyone, all Orthodox leadership have said that what non-Orthodox clergy do is worthless. We saw a doubting conservative, but generally speaking, it's worthless. It doesn't mean that we have to totally neglect and put our heads in the sand. Really, that's what he's saying. He said, that's what Rabbi Lam is saying. You can't ignore the reality. The reality is that these people have huge memberships. Is that these people are promoting sometimes Torah goals, right? Light unto the nations. These types of things, which are important things. When it comes to these types of things, you can't deny the influence that they have. And therefore, in these types of things, it may not be a bad idea to grant them validity and respect in that sense. Legitimacy, absolutely not. We cannot grant them legitimacy. And we've seen in the last hour, they have no legitimacy halachically in the slightest. But when it comes to global goals, communal goals, these types of things, like we saw in Soloveitchik and by Lam, then there is room to say that perhaps communal participation could be authorized. Now, of course, there will be many who would argue with this. I'm on a group of federation, and a question which just yesterday was asked, Reb Zimmerman, was this person runs a charity business he runs, and I'll end with this. He runs a charity business, and a reform organization has asked the charity, business, the person who owns the charity business, whether he can run a charity for their organization. Would it be permissible for him to do so or not? And his response was, his exact response was that it might be permissible if it would be done anyway, interestingly. He said it shouldn't really do it, but it might be permissible if anyway done. That's the idea we said before, that if something can be done anyway, then it may be permissible. So he's saying if they'll find another charity, they'll be fine to do so. But these types of questions are really interesting questions and really difficult questions. How do we deal in our relationship with other Jews? Is every time we allow them to combine with us, is that giving them legitimacy or not? These are the really tight questions which we have to think about with common sense and practicality. And yes, we cannot give them any legitimacy, halachic legitimacy. That's out of the question. They have absolutely no power at all in that sense. But with regards to other forms of validity, that is questionable, and that's what we've seen tonight, that some would argue that it would be permissible to do so. So I hope you enjoyed that. To answer our question, how important are denominations? I think we've seen very clearly from a halachic perspective, they're extremely important and critical. With regards to other things, it's not so clear-cut, and there may be room to argue that when it comes to global projects, that we may be able to, denominations should be ignored and to work hand in hand with them. Okay, I'll go through. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. Rabbi Lam tried his best to reach out to other denominations to help solve problems of Gerushin Kedushin and work with them, and he was an ambassador from the right. I go down. Yeah, Reb Shera. It's well known, Reb Shera, an ambassador. Yeah, correct. Yeah, in the yeshiva world, Rabbi Lam was totally ruled out, unfortunately. Powerful from Rabbi Lam. He's not accepting them or their wrong approach, but at the same time not ignoring reality. Exactly. That's you can't ignore the reality that these people have influence, and
under the majority in the US.
In the majority, yeah. So you have to sometimes, you have to, as I said, it's a very fine line to balance, and you have to make sure we tread with caution and we don't grant them legitimacy, and it doesn't look like by doing things with them that we grant them legitimacy, but at the same time can't deny the reality. In the Sephardi Teshuvah, all the principles of the time of the conservative Edim or kosher and bam statim about they don't discuss them. They don't get into that in any detail at all. It's not about they're just talking generally about muchzak likfira. No one actually defines what that means, muchzak likfira. And all these teshuvot from Moshe and the Bavadi teshuvah as well, no one actually defines what it actually means muchzak likfira.
They don't say when they research these the rabbis or the adim, they don't say what.
No, it's funny they don't. The one he wrote, he's got interesting shittot about Torah min hashamayim. That was one of the quotations. Yeah, they didn't go into the exact details of what they believe or not. It's clear that conservative reform are kofrim. I'm sorry, that's clear. They deny Torah min hashamayim, even conservative. They're definitely, from the Rambam's perspective, or Rabbi Albo, 1303, everyone believes in Torah min hashamayim, right? And even if you believe like Louis Jacobs, which is a divinely inspired Torah min hashamayim, that's still kfirah, right? Because it's not given to Moshe from Sinai. So that's not up for discussion. That's irrelevant whether it's the Rambam or Rabbi Albo. So I don't know how relevant that is. Conservative going through an existential crisis. Merger Chacham received permission from Chacham Matum Ma'olan. Teaching conservative back in the early days. Wow. Yes, that's right. Yes, I remember that now. Yes, correct. Mark Shapiro brings that in the book. There was, and in fact, Mordechai Eliyahu wrote about that, and I think he kashered him at the end, despite him teaching in the conservative assembly. Yeah, very good. He was allowed as Parnasan, was to teach Talmud according to Orthodox way. However, even then, he wasn't a rabbi of the congregation; he was rather a teacher, president of the university. That's when Saul Liebman. Very good. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. Good point. Yeah, Jack. encroaching on halachic realm in any way, whether associating them gives some form of halachic approval. I think it's the latter. You're right, there is a halachic dimension here, and that is by you helping them raise money, are they going to now go and use that money for to promote things which are against Torah? But there's both elements there. There's both elements there. Okay. Bilad Znut Sina, have you cleared up Bilad Znut? Have you understood that? I think it seems like you understood that. Okay. So if there's no further questions, I think we'll leave it here. It's been wonderful being with everyone this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And B'ezrat Hashem, look forward to seeing you sometime soon again.
Thank you, Raf. Thank you.
Zak Baruch.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.